Hello everyone, welcome back to Buried Files. Tonight we bring you 6 deeply disturbing true park ranger horror stories that will make anyone reconsider their next trip into the wilderness. These are not fictional campfire tales or urban legends, but actual documented encounters reported by park rangers who patrol the most isolated and dangerous regions of our national forests. Each account has been cross-referenced with official incident reports, witness statements, and corroborated testimony from multiple sources. The deep wilderness holds dangers that most visitors will never see, and those who protect these lands have witnessed things that defy rational explanation. If you appreciate genuine horror content based on real events that happen to real people, subscribe to Buried Files and hit the notification bell so you never miss our next investigation into the terrifying truth. After listening to these accounts, we want to hear from you in the comments below about your own experiences in remote wilderness areas or any encounters you have had with the unexplained. Now settle in as we explore the darkness that awaits those who venture too far from civilization. Kyle had been a park ranger for 3 seasons at the northern edge of a vast wilderness preserve that stretched across thousands of acres of dense forest, rocky terrain, and isolated valleys where cell phone signals disappeared and GPS devices often malfunctioned. He was not the type to scare easily. He had grown up in rural country north of Toronto, spent his teenage years hunting and fishing with his grandfather, and believed he understood the patterns of nature better than most people. The forest was his workplace, but it had also become something close to home. He preferred the rhythm of the wilderness to the chaos of urban life, and he found peace in the solitude that came with patrolling miles of trail without encountering another human being for days at a time. During late autumn, when the tourist season died down and the trails emptied of hikers and campers, Kyle preferred the solitude even more. The silence of the woods felt cleaner than the noise of civilization. The animals moved differently when humans were not constantly invading their territory, and Kyle enjoyed observing their natural behavior without the interference of crowds. He had always believed that the forest was predictable if someone knew how to read it properly. Weather patterns, animal movements, seasonal changes, all of it followed logical rules that made sense to anyone who paid attention. That belief was shattered during his final patrol of the season, an experience so disturbing that Kyle requested a transfer to a different park hundreds of miles away and refused to ever discuss what had happened in detail with anyone, except the investigators who questioned him afterward. It happened during the last week of October. The park was nearly deserted, with only a handful of dedicated hikers and photographers still visiting the remote trails. Kyle was one of only 2 rangers still stationed at the preserve, and his patrol area covered the northern section where the terrain became increasingly difficult and dangerous. The trails there were poorly maintained, and signs warned visitors that they were entering backcountry where rescue operations could take hours or even days if someone got injured or lost. Most people avoided that area entirely, which was exactly why Kyle enjoyed patrolling it. The fog had rolled in thick that afternoon, turning the familiar trails into ghostly corridors where visibility dropped to maybe 15 feet at best. Every sound seemed muffled and distorted, as if the fog itself was absorbing noise and reshaping it into something unnatural. Kyle was finishing his final patrol of the day, planning to head back to his cabin before darkness made navigation impossible, when he noticed something unusual near an unauthorized trailhead that was supposed to be gated and locked. There was a truck parked there, windows fogged over from the inside, doors locked, engine cold, but not completely frozen. The truck looked abandoned, yet something about it felt wrong. Kyle walked around the vehicle, shining his flashlight through the windows, and saw nothing obviously alarming inside. No blood, no signs of struggle. Just an empty interior with a jacket thrown across the back seat and an empty coffee cup in the holder. He tried the doors, but they were all locked. Kyle radioed the truck's license plate number to dispatch, but the signal was weak and kept cutting out. After several attempts, he finally got through, and dispatch told him to wait for backup before investigating further. But Kyle could not shake the feeling that something was wrong. The truck's engine was still warm, which meant whoever had driven it there had not been gone long. And the location was bizarre. The trailhead was supposed to be closed, and getting past the gate required either cutting the lock or climbing over it with the vehicle, neither of which seemed likely given that the gate appeared intact. Kyle decided he could not wait for backup. If someone was injured on the trail, every minute could matter. He grabbed his emergency pack, checked his radio one more time, and started down the trail, following a set of fresh boot prints that led into the fog. The boot prints were erratic, zigzagging across the trail like the person who made them had been confused, disoriented, or possibly panicking. They occasionally veered off the path entirely, then returned to it as if the person had gotten lost and corrected course. Kyle followed them for nearly 20 minutes, moving slowly and calling out periodically to announce his presence as a park ranger and ask if anyone needed assistance. The fog grew thicker the deeper he went, until Kyle could barely see 10 feet ahead. His flashlight beam seemed to dissolve into the white void, creating strange shapes and shadows that disappeared when he moved the light to focus on them directly. That was when he first heard the voice. It was faint and distant, barely audible over the sound of his own breathing and footsteps. "Help me. Please help me." The voice sounded desperate, frightened, and unmistakably human. Kyle stopped and shouted back, asking for the person's location and assuring them that he was a park ranger coming to help. But the voice did not respond to his questions. It just kept repeating the same plea over and over, always from a slightly different direction. Kyle quickened his pace, trying to home in on the source of the voice. But every time he thought he was getting closer, the voice seemed to shift and come from somewhere else entirely. After another 10 minutes of following the voice through the fog, Kyle saw a figure stumble out from behind a cluster of trees about 30 feet ahead. It was a man, clothes torn and dirty, face pale and gaunt, moving with the unsteady gait of someone on the verge of collapse. Kyle rushed forward and caught the man just as his legs gave out beneath him. The man was shivering violently, his skin cold and clammy to the touch, his eyes wide and unfocused. Kyle lowered him to the ground carefully and started asking questions. What was his name? How long had he been out here? Was he injured? Was anyone else with him? The man's lips moved, but at first no sound came out. Then, in a hoarse whisper, he said his name was Mark. He had been lost for 3 days. He needed to get out of the forest immediately. When Kyle asked him about the truck at the trailhead, Mark's entire body went rigid. His eyes focused suddenly, locking onto Kyle's face with an intensity that was almost frightening. Mark grabbed Kyle's jacket with surprising strength and pulled him closer. "Do not go further down the trail," he said urgently. "You have to get me out of here now. We have to leave right now." Kyle tried to calm him down, explaining that he needed to assess Mark for injuries before moving him and that an ambulance would need to meet them at the trailhead. But Mark was not listening. He kept repeating that they had to leave immediately, that it was not safe, that something was wrong with the forest. Kyle assumed the man was suffering from hypothermia or dehydration, both of which could cause confusion and irrational behavior. He reached for his radio to call for medical support, and that was when they both heard it. A voice, clear and unmistakable, calling from somewhere deeper in the fog. "Help me, please. I am in the trees. Help me." Kyle froze. The voice sounded exactly like the one he had been following for the past 30 minutes. But he was here now, with the man who had been calling for help. So who was that? Mark's eyes went even wider and he shook his head violently. "Do not answer him," he whispered, his voice trembling. "They are not real. It mimics people. It pretends to be lost. It uses voices to bring you deeper." Kyle stared at him, trying to process what he was hearing. "What do you mean it mimics people? What is it?" But before Mark could answer, his body began to convulse violently. Mark's back arched unnaturally, his head thrown back, his mouth open in a silent scream. Foam appeared at the corners of his lips, and his eyes rolled back until only the whites were visible. Kyle immediately shifted into emergency response mode, trying to stabilize Mark and keep his airway clear while simultaneously attempting to reach dispatch on his radio. But the radio emitted only static now, no matter which channel he tried or how he adjusted the antenna. The fog seemed to press in closer, thicker, until Kyle could barely see 5 feet in any direction. Mark's convulsions stopped as suddenly as they had started. His body went completely limp, and for a terrible moment, Kyle thought he had died. But then Mark's eyes snapped open again, staring straight up at the fog-covered sky, and his mouth moved. Words came out, but they were not in Mark's voice anymore. It was something else, something that sounded like multiple voices layered over each other, speaking in unison but slightly out of sync. The words were incomprehensible, not any language Kyle recognized. Then Mark's head twisted to the side, far beyond what should have been physically possible, rotating almost completely backward until he was staring directly at Kyle despite his body still facing upward. Kyle scrambled backward, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might burst. Mark's face was blank, expressionless, his eyes wide and unblinking. Then, slowly, impossibly, Mark began to stand. But he did not stand the way a human being stands. His body rose from the ground in one fluid motion, as if being lifted by invisible strings, his limbs hanging loosely until he was fully upright. He stood there for several seconds, swaying slightly, his head still twisted at that impossible angle. Kyle's hand went to his service weapon, but he could not bring himself to draw it. This was not a threat he understood, not something he had been trained to handle. Then Mark collapsed, not the way he had risen, but suddenly and completely, like a puppet whose strings had been cut all at once. He hit the ground hard, and this time, Kyle could see immediately that he was dead. There was no breathing, no pulse, no signs of life whatsoever. Kyle finally managed to get his radio working again, and within seconds he was shouting for emergency backup, for medical support, for anyone who could hear him to respond. His voice was shaking, his words tumbling over each other in a rush. He knew he sounded panicked, unprofessional, but he could not help it. Nothing in his training had prepared him for this. The rescue team arrived 45 minutes later, though it felt like hours to Kyle. They brought portable lights and medical equipment, and they immediately went to work examining Mark's body. Kyle watched from several feet away, still shaking, unable to look directly at Mark's twisted form. The paramedics worked quickly and efficiently, but after only a few minutes, they pronounced Mark dead at the scene. They could not identify an immediate cause of death. No obvious wounds, no signs of trauma, no indication of what had killed him. When Kyle gave Mark's description and explained where he had found him, one of the senior rangers pulled him aside. His face had gone pale. "What did you say his name was?" the ranger asked. Kyle repeated that the man had said his name was Mark, that he had been lost for 3 days, and that he had been trying to warn Kyle about something in the forest before he died. The senior ranger was quiet for a long moment, then pulled out his phone and showed Kyle a photograph. "Is this him?" Kyle looked at the photo and felt his stomach drop. It was Mark, unmistakably the same man. But the photo was from a missing persons report filed 6 years earlier. Mark had disappeared while hiking in this exact area, and despite extensive search operations, no trace of him had ever been found. Kyle insisted there had to be a mistake. The man he had found was real, physical, not a ghost or hallucination. The senior ranger did not argue, but he did explain that a search team would be sent out immediately to investigate the area where Kyle had found Mark. If someone had been surviving in the wilderness for 6 years, or if there was evidence of foul play, they needed to know. Kyle was told to return to the ranger station and write a detailed report of everything that had happened. He did as instructed, though his hands shook so badly he could barely type. The search team returned 8 hours later with disturbing news. They had followed the trail Kyle described, using his GPS coordinates and his written directions. But according to their findings, no such trail existed in that area. The coordinates Kyle provided led to a section of forest so dense and overgrown that it was impassable without machetes to clear the way. There were no boot prints, no signs of human passage, no indication that anyone had been there recently. The truck that had been parked at the unauthorized trailhead was traced to a man who had reported it stolen 3 weeks earlier from a parking lot 200 miles away. The truck yielded no forensic evidence connecting it to Mark or to anyone else. The official report concluded that Kyle had found an unidentified individual suffering from severe medical distress, possibly a drifter or homeless person who had been living rough in the forest. The disorientation and confusion Kyle experienced was attributed to the fog, exhaustion, and the stress of the situation. Mark's true identity was never definitively established, though dental records eventually suggested he might have been the missing hiker from 6 years earlier. How he had survived that long, where he had been, and what had happened to him remained complete mysteries. The cause of death was listed as undetermined pending further investigation, but no further investigation ever took place. Kyle knows what he saw. He knows what he heard. And he knows that Mark tried to warn him about something before he died. The locals who live near that forest have their own explanations. Stories passed down through generations about things that live in the deep woods. They talk about mimics, entities that can copy human voices and appearances, that build false trails and lure people deeper into the wilderness, where they can never find their way out. They say the fog is when the mimics are most active, when the boundary between the real world and whatever exists in the deepest parts of the forest becomes thin. Kyle does not patrol that area anymore. He requested and received a transfer to a different park in a different state, somewhere with shorter trees, less fog, and trails that stay exactly where they are supposed to be. But even there, in his new posting hundreds of miles away, Kyle sometimes hears a voice at night when he is alone in his cabin. It comes from just past the tree line, faint and distant, calling for help. And every time he hears it, Kyle locks his doors, closes his windows, and refuses to respond. Because he knows now that some voices in the wilderness should never be answered, and some trails should never be followed, no matter how desperate the plea for help might sound. Tom worked as a park ranger at a sprawling national park known for its dense old-growth forests, rugged mountain terrain, and hundreds of miles of backcountry trails that attracted serious hikers and wilderness enthusiasts from across the country. The park was remote enough that cell phone coverage was non-existent in most areas, and the nearest town with a hospital was over an hour's drive from the main ranger station. Tom had been working there for 2 years, and he had come to appreciate the isolation and self-sufficiency that the job required. He bunked at the staff quarters, a cluster of small cabins situated about 3 miles from the main visitor center, along with several other rangers who rotated through different patrol schedules throughout the season. The work was mostly routine during the off-season, when tourist numbers dropped dramatically. Tom spent his days checking trail conditions, monitoring wildlife activity, maintaining facilities, and occasionally assisting lost or injured hikers who had underestimated the difficulty of the terrain. He had encountered bears on multiple occasions, dealt with aggressive wildlife, and rescued hikers suffering from everything from twisted ankles to severe dehydration. But nothing in his training or experience had prepared him for what happened one August night when the summer season was winding down and the park was transitioning into the quieter autumn months. It was close to 11 o'clock at night, and Tom had just finished his shift and returned to his cabin. He had changed into comfortable clothes, made himself dinner, and was planning to read for an hour before going to sleep. The cabin was small but functional, with a single bedroom, a bathroom, a kitchenette, and a living area with a wood-burning stove that Tom rarely needed during the summer months. The windows were open to let in the cool night air, and Tom could hear the familiar sounds of the forest settling down for the night. Crickets, the occasional hoot of an owl, wind rustling through the pine trees. It was peaceful, the kind of quiet that Tom had grown to love about living in the wilderness. Then he heard voices. They were high-pitched, desperate, and growing louder as they approached his cabin. Tom immediately recognized the sound of people in distress. He grabbed his flashlight and pulled on his boots, not bothering to change out of his sweatpants and t-shirt, and hurried to the door. Before he could open it, frantic knocking erupted against the wood, hard and insistent. Tom opened the door quickly and found himself face to face with 2 young women, both in their early 20s, both pale and terrified. One of them had a jacket tied awkwardly around her left shoulder, and blood was soaking through the fabric, dark and wet in the beam of his flashlight. Tom immediately went into emergency response mode. He brought them inside, turned on all the lights, and grabbed his first aid kit from the cabinet. The woman with the injured shoulder collapsed onto his floor, breathing heavily, her face twisted in pain. Her friend kneeled beside her, holding her hand and speaking in a shaky voice, trying to reassure her that everything would be all right. Tom kneeled down and carefully removed the makeshift bandage to examine the wound. What he saw made his stomach turn. It was a bite mark, not from a bear or mountain lion or any other animal Tom had ever encountered in his years of wilderness work. The pattern was distinctly human, deep, vicious, and clearly made by human teeth that had clamped down with tremendous force and torn away flesh. The wound was bleeding heavily, and the edges were ragged and infected-looking. Tom could see bruising around the bite that suggested the attack had happened hours earlier, and the woman was likely going into shock from blood loss and trauma. Tom asked what had happened, trying to keep his voice calm and professional, even though his mind was racing. The uninjured woman explained that they had been hiking one of the backcountry trails, planning to camp overnight at a designated site about 5 miles from the ranger cabins. They had been walking for about an hour after sunset, using headlamps to navigate, when they heard someone walking behind them on the trail. At first, they thought it was another hiker, which was unusual but not unheard of. They called out a greeting but received no response. The footsteps continued, keeping pace with them, staying just far enough back that they could not see who was following them. The women had started walking faster, feeling increasingly uneasy about the silent follower. The footsteps behind them matched their pace, speeding up when they sped up, slowing down when they slowed down. Then they heard breathing, heavy and labored, coming from the darkness just beyond the reach of their headlamps. One of the women turned around to confront whoever was following them, shining her light directly behind them. That was when they saw him. A man, completely naked, standing in the middle of the trail about 20 feet away. His skin was filthy, covered in dirt and what looked like dried blood. His hair was long and matted, hanging down past his shoulders, and he was smiling at them. Before either woman could react, the man charged. He moved with shocking speed, closing the distance between them in seconds. He tackled the woman who had turned to look at him, knocking her to the ground hard enough to knock the wind out of her. Then he bit down on her shoulder, his teeth sinking deep into her flesh. She screamed and tried to fight him off, but he was strong, far stronger than his emaciated frame suggested he should be. Her friend kicked him as hard as she could in the ribs, and he finally let go, rolling off and curling into a ball, making a high-pitched keening sound that was almost animalistic. The women scrambled to their feet and ran. They expected him to chase them immediately, but for a few precious seconds he stayed on the ground, still making that terrible sound. When he finally stood up and started running after them, they had a head start. They ran faster than either of them had ever run in their lives, abandoning their backpacks and camping gear, focused only on getting away. The man pursued them, and they could hear him crashing through the underbrush behind them, breathing heavily, occasionally making sounds that were halfway between words and growls. They ran for almost 30 minutes before they finally saw lights ahead and realized they were approaching the ranger cabins. The man was still behind them, though he had fallen back somewhat. When they reached Tom's cabin and started pounding on the door, they heard the footsteps stop. The man had apparently decided not to follow them all the way to the ranger station. By the time Tom opened the door, he was gone. Tom grabbed his radio and called his co-worker, another ranger named Mike, who bunked in a cabin about 200 yards away. Mike arrived within minutes, carrying his service weapon and a powerful spotlight. Tom explained the situation quickly, and Mike's face went pale when he saw the bite wound. He immediately agreed to stay with the women while Tom went to search for the attacker. Tom knew it was dangerous, possibly foolish, but those women needed protection, and the man who had attacked them was still out there somewhere, potentially a threat to anyone else in the area. Tom strapped on his duty belt, checked his pistol to make sure it was loaded and ready, and grabbed his most powerful flashlight. He put on his ranger jacket despite the warm night air, wanting the extra layer of protection and the authority of his uniform. He stepped out into the darkness, his heart pounding, his senses hyper-alert to every sound and movement around him. The forest that had felt peaceful and familiar an hour earlier now felt hostile and threatening. Tom moved carefully along the trail the women had described, his flashlight sweeping back and forth across the trees and undergrowth. He was looking for any sign of movement, the indication of where the attacker might have gone. The trail was well maintained here, wide enough for two people to walk side by side with clear sight lines in most directions. After about 10 minutes of walking, Tom found the backpacks the women had abandoned. They were lying in the middle of the trail, contents spilled out, clearly dropped in a panic. Tom continued forward, moving more slowly now, his hand resting on his holstered weapon. That was when he saw him. About 40 yards ahead, partially hidden by a cluster of large rocks near the trail, was a figure. Tom raised his flashlight, and the beam caught the man fully. He was exactly as the women had described. Completely naked, filthy, emaciated, with long matted hair. He was crouched down, hunched over something Tom could not immediately identify. The man was making wet, chewing sounds. Tom's flashlight beam hit the man squarely, and the man's head snapped up. His eyes reflected the light like an animal's eyes, glowing pale green in the darkness. For a long, terrible moment, they stared at each other. Tom could see now what the man had been eating. It looked like a dead rabbit, partially skinned, being consumed raw. Blood covered the man's face and hands, glistening in the flashlight beam. Tom shouted, identifying himself as a park ranger and ordering the man to get on the ground immediately. His voice was loud, authoritative, projecting all the command presence he had been trained to use in dangerous situations. But the man did not comply. Instead, he stood up slowly, rising to his full height, which was considerable. He was well over 6 feet tall, and despite his emaciated appearance, his frame suggested he had once been quite muscular. He stood there, swaying slightly, still holding the dead rabbit in one hand. Then he smiled. It was the same smile the women had described, wide and unnatural, showing teeth stained dark with blood. Tom repeated his command, louder this time, his hand moving to draw his weapon. The man tilted his head to one side, studying Tom with an expression that seemed almost curious. Then he spoke. His voice was rough and rasping, as if he had not used it in a very long time. "Are you alone?" he asked. The question sent a chill down Tom's spine. It was not what he had expected. There was a calculation behind it, an intelligence that contradicted the feral appearance and behavior. Tom did not answer. He drew his weapon, holding it in a ready position, finger alongside the trigger guard, not yet on the trigger itself. He gave one final command for the man to get on the ground with his hands visible. The man dropped the rabbit. Then, without warning, he turned and sprinted into the forest. But he did not run the way a normal person runs on difficult terrain in darkness. He moved with the speed and agility of something that knew the forest intimately, that could navigate it by instinct rather than sight. He disappeared into the undergrowth so quickly that Tom barely had time to react. Tom pursued for a short distance, but the man was gone, vanished completely into the darkness. Tom stopped, breathing hard, his weapon still drawn, listening intently for any sound that might indicate which direction the man had gone. There was nothing. The forest had gone completely silent. No crickets, no owls, no wind. Just an oppressive, unnatural quiet that made Tom's skin crawl. He backed away slowly, keeping his flashlight and weapon ready, and made his way back toward the cabins. He radioed for law enforcement backup, providing as much detail as he could about the encounter and the direction the man had fled. Then he returned to his cabin, where Mike was still standing guard over the two women. The injured woman had been given first aid, and Mike had managed to slow the bleeding, but she clearly needed proper medical attention. Tom radioed for an ambulance, which arrived 20 minutes later along with 2 sheriff's deputies. The woman was transported to the hospital, where she received treatment for the bite wound and was given a series of vaccinations as a precaution against infection. Her friend was interviewed extensively by the deputies, and both women provided detailed statements about what had happened. Law enforcement officers and additional park rangers conducted an extensive search of the area over the next 48 hours. They brought tracking dogs, thermal imaging equipment, and dozens of personnel to comb through the forest. What they found was deeply disturbing. About 2 miles from where Tom had encountered the naked man, searchers discovered evidence of a long-term camp. It was well hidden in a natural depression surrounded by thick undergrowth, nearly invisible unless someone knew exactly where to look. The camp contained disturbing evidence of prolonged habitation. There were bones scattered around a fire pit, some clearly animal, but others that required forensic analysis to identify. There were remnants of clothing, tools made from sharpened stones and animal bones, and carvings on nearby trees that seemed to mark territory or perhaps serve some other purpose investigators could not determine. Most disturbing of all, they found items that had clearly been taken from hikers. Backpacks, wallets, identification cards, cameras. Some of the items were recent, but others dated back years. Forensic analysis later confirmed that some of the bones found at the campsite were human. DNA testing identified remains from at least 3 individuals, all of whom had been reported missing while hiking in the park over the previous 6 years. The investigation expanded dramatically, becoming a multi-agency effort involving the FBI and state police. But despite the extensive manhunt, the naked man was never found. He had disappeared into the vast wilderness of the national park, and if he was still there, he knew how to avoid detection. Tom continued working as a ranger, but he transferred to a different section of the park, one with higher visitor traffic and more regular patrols. He never worked alone in remote areas again, always insisting on having a partner for backcountry patrols. The 2 women recovered physically, though both required extensive counseling for post-traumatic stress. The woman who had been bitten still bears the scars on her shoulder, a permanent reminder of how close she came to becoming another missing person statistic. Tom thinks about that night often. He thinks about the question the man asked him. "Are you alone?" It suggests planning, calculation, predatory behavior that goes beyond simple madness or survival instinct. It suggests that the man was evaluating Tom as potential prey, weighing the risks, deciding whether to attack or flee. Tom knows how lucky he was that the man chose to flee. He also knows that somewhere in that vast forest, in the places where maps end and trails disappear, there are predators far more dangerous than any bear or mountain lion. And some of them walk on 2 legs, smile with human teeth, and ask questions before they decide whether to kill. May worked as a park ranger at a sprawling wilderness reserve, known primarily for its extensive cave systems that attracted spelunkers and adventure seekers from across the region. The caves ranged from simple tourist-friendly chambers with guided tours to dangerous technical systems that required specialized equipment and training to navigate safely. Search and rescue operations were a regular part of May's job, though most incidents were relatively routine. Twisted ankles from hikers who underestimated the terrain, cases of dehydration during summer months, occasional broken bones from falls. May had been trained for cave rescue specifically, completing a rigorous certification program that covered rope work, confined space operations, and emergency medical response in underground environments. But despite all her training, she had never been called for anything truly serious. That changed one afternoon in early autumn. It was a Tuesday, typically one of the quieter days of the week, when a frantic hiker burst through the doors of the ranger station. He was out of breath, sweating heavily despite the cool temperature, and clearly in a state of panic. He identified himself as Balint and explained between gasps that 2 people had gone missing inside one of the park's most dangerous cave systems. Balint said he and his friend Mark had been hiking near the entrance to a cave that was officially closed to the public due to safety concerns. They had noticed a young boy, maybe 8 or 9 years old, crawling into the narrow entrance. Concerned that a child was entering such a dangerous area unsupervised, Mark had made the decision to follow the boy into the tunnel, assuring Balint that he would just make sure the kid was safe and would return in a few minutes. But Mark never came back. Balint had waited for nearly 20 minutes, calling into the cave entrance, hearing nothing but his own voice echoing back. Finally, worried that something had happened to his friend, Baylant had crawled into the narrow tunnel himself, moving slowly and carefully, calling out for Mark. The tunnel extended about 50 yards before opening into a larger chamber, but Baylant saw no sign of Mark or the boy. The chamber had multiple passages leading off in different directions, and Baylant realized that attempting to search further without proper equipment or knowledge of the cave system would be suicidal. He had backed out, run the 2 miles to where his car was parked, driven until he found cell service, and called for help. May immediately contacted the park superintendent and activated the search and rescue team. Within 90 minutes, 8 team members had assembled at the cave entrance, including 2 specialists with extensive caving experience. Baylant was there as well, still visibly shaken, insisting on joining the search despite being advised to let the professionals handle it. He kept repeating that something had felt wrong about the whole situation. The boy had not responded when they called to him, had not looked back even once, and had moved in a strange, jerky manner that did not seem natural for a child. The team entered the cave system fully equipped with climbing gear, helmets with mounted lights, radios, rope, and emergency supplies. The entrance tunnel was exactly as Baylant had described, narrow enough that they had to crawl single file, barely wide enough for an adult to fit through comfortably. The walls were damp and cold, and the air smelled of minerals and stagnant water. After what felt like an eternity, but was actually only about 10 minutes of crawling, the tunnel opened into a chamber roughly the size of a large living room. Their helmet lights revealed several passages leading off in different directions, some sloping upward, others descending deeper into the earth. That was where they found Mark's backpack. It was lying in the center of the chamber, contents partially spilled out. Flashlight, water bottle, trail mix, a phone with a dead battery. But there was no sign of Mark himself, and no sign of the boy. The team leader made the decision to split into 2 groups to cover more ground while maintaining safety protocols. May's group consisted of herself, one of the cave specialists, and Baylant, who had refused to wait at the surface. They would explore the passages that descended, while the other team would check the upward sloping routes. May's group moved carefully through a passage that grew progressively narrower and steeper, descending at an angle that required them to use their hands to steady themselves against the slick walls. The temperature dropped noticeably as they went deeper, and the air became thinner, harder to breathe. The only sounds were their own breathing, the scrape of their boots against stone, and the occasional drip of water echoing from somewhere in the darkness beyond their lights. They had been descending for approximately 20 minutes when May heard something that made her blood run cold. It was a child's voice, faint and distant, calling for help. The voice seemed to be coming from somewhere below them, deeper in the cave system. May radioed the other team to report what they were hearing, and after a brief discussion, her team was given authorization to continue following the sound, while the other team maintained their current position as a safety anchor. They moved forward through a particularly tight passage that required them to turn sideways to fit through, their helmet lights casting strange shadows on the striated rock walls. The passage eventually opened into a massive cavern, far larger than any chamber they had encountered so far. Their lights could not reach the ceiling or the far walls. The space felt vast and ancient, as if they had descended into some primordial void that existed outside normal reality. And standing in the center of that vast darkness, barely visible in the beam of their helmet lights, was Mark. He was standing completely still, facing away from them, his posture rigid and unnatural. May called his name, her voice echoing strangely in the enormous space. Mark did not respond. The team approached cautiously, calling out to him repeatedly, asking if he was injured, if he could hear them. As they got closer, May could see that Mark's clothes were torn and filthy, and his hands were covered in blood. Deep scratches and abrasions covered his fingers and palms, as if he had been clawing desperately at the cave walls. When they finally reached him, and the cave specialist reached out to touch his shoulder, May shone her light on Mark's face and saw something that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Mark's eyes were open, but they were completely white. Not closed, not rolled back, but simply white, as if his pupils and irises had disappeared entirely. His mouth hung open slack, and a low whispering sound was coming from his throat. The whispers were not words, not in any language May recognized, but they were rhythmic and deliberate, as if Mark was reciting something. The cave specialist pulled his hand back immediately, and that was when Mark screamed. It was not a human sound. It was high-pitched and piercing, echoing through the cavern with such intensity that May felt it vibrating in her chest. The scream went on and on, impossibly long, as if Mark did not need to breathe. Then he collapsed. His body went rigid and he fell straight backward, hitting the stone floor hard. The team immediately went into emergency medical response mode. The cave specialist checked for a pulse and found one, weak and irregular. Mark's skin was ice cold despite the physical exertion of whatever he had been through. He was breathing, but barely, and his body was completely unresponsive to any stimuli. May radioed for an emergency extraction team while the cave specialist and Baylant began the difficult process of preparing Mark for transport. Moving an unconscious person through narrow cave passages is extraordinarily dangerous, but leaving him there was not an option. They fashioned a makeshift stretcher using rope and emergency blankets, secured Mark as safely as possible, and began the arduous journey back to the surface. It took over 3 hours to navigate back through the passages, moving inch by inch, carefully maneuvering the stretcher through tight spaces, constantly monitoring Mark's vital signs. By the time they emerged from the cave entrance, it was fully dark outside. An ambulance was waiting, and paramedics immediately took over Mark's care. He was still unconscious, still unresponsive, his body temperature dangerously low, despite being wrapped in thermal blankets. He was airlifted to a regional hospital with a specialized trauma unit, where doctors worked frantically to stabilize him. May provided a detailed report of everything they had found, but she deliberately left out the detail about Mark's eyes. She did not know how to explain it, and she was not sure anyone would believe her anyway. Mark remained in a comatose state for 3 weeks. During that time, May and the other team members were interviewed repeatedly by park officials and law enforcement. The cave system was extensively searched by professional spelunkers and rescue teams, but no trace of the young boy was ever found. No lost child had been reported in the area. No families had contacted authorities about a missing son. It was as if the boy had never existed at all, except that both Baylant and Mark had seen him, and Mark had followed him into the cave. When Mark finally regained consciousness, he had no memory of what had happened after he entered the cave. He remembered crawling through the entrance tunnel and seeing the boy ahead of him, but after that, nothing. Complete blank emptiness until he woke up in the hospital. He could not explain his injuries, had no recollection of clawing at the cave walls or how he had ended up in that massive cavern. Most disturbing of all, Mark insisted that from his perspective, he had only been in the cave for a few minutes. He had no sense that hours had passed, no awareness of the time that had elapsed between entering the cave and being found. Medical examinations revealed no obvious cause for his condition. No head trauma, no drugs in his system, no neurological damage that could account for the memory loss or the catatonic state he had been found in. His injuries were consistent with sustained physical exertion against rough stone surfaces. But doctors could not explain why he would have been clawing at cave walls or what had caused his eyes to appear the way May had described. The official report concluded that Mark had likely experienced a severe panic attack and psychological break triggered by getting lost in an unfamiliar cave system, combined with possible carbon dioxide buildup in poorly ventilated passages. May left the Park Service 6 months after the incident. She completed her remaining contract obligations, but she could not continue working in that environment. Every time she saw a cave entrance, she thought about that massive cavern and the sound of Mark's inhuman scream echoing through the darkness. She had nightmares about it regularly, dreams where she was back in that cavern and heard the child's voice calling for help. In her dreams, she followed the voice deeper and deeper into passages that seemed to extend forever, spiraling down into the earth, never reaching an end. Local folklore about the cave systems in that region includes numerous references to children's voices that lure people underground. Stories passed down through generations speak of caves that are doorways to something older and more dangerous than anyone can understand. Places where the normal rules of reality do not apply, and where time moves differently. May does not know if she believes in such things, but she knows what she saw in that cavern. She knows the look on Mark's face and the sound he made, and she knows she will never set foot in another cave again, no matter the circumstances. Mike had been a park ranger for nearly 15 years, most of that time spent in remote wilderness areas where he could go days without seeing another human being. The solitude suited him perfectly. He had always been more comfortable in nature than in cities, more at ease with the rhythms of the forest than with the noise and chaos of modern life. Mike believed that the wilderness was where he truly belonged, where he felt most at peace with himself and the world. But that sense of peace was completely shattered during his final season as a ranger, an experience so profoundly disturbing that Mike left the profession entirely, moved to a different state, and refused to discuss what had happened with anyone except a therapist he eventually consulted years later. The incident occurred during the last week of October. The park was nearly empty, the tourist season long finished, and Mike was one of only 3 rangers still stationed at the remote outpost that served as the base for monitoring the northern section of the preserve. He was conducting a routine patrol of a trail that wound through particularly dense forest when he noticed something unusual. There was a clearing in the woods that Mike had never seen before, despite having walked this trail dozens of times over the years. The clearing was perfectly circular, approximately 20 feet in diameter, and the ground inside the circle was completely bare. No grass, no leaves, no undergrowth, just dark soil that looked as if it had been freshly turned. What made it even stranger was that there was no obvious explanation for the clearing. It did not look like it had been burned. There was no smell of smoke and no charring on the surrounding trees. It did not look like it had been cleared by machinery. There were no tire tracks or tool marks. It simply existed. A perfect circle of bare earth in the middle of dense forest. Mike took photographs, marked the location on his GPS unit, and radioed a report to the park superintendent. He was told that someone would come out to investigate within the next few days, and that he should continue his patrol. That night, back at his cabin, Mike heard a voice outside. It started as barely more than a whisper, so faint that at first Mike thought he was imagining it. But as the evening progressed and darkness fell completely, the voice grew gradually louder and more distinct. It was calling his name, not shouting, but speaking it clearly and deliberately, over and over. Mike grabbed his flashlight and stepped outside, scanning the tree line with the beam. There was nothing there. No movement, no signs of anyone hiding in the woods. He called out, identifying himself as a ranger and asking who was there. The voice did not answer his question. It just continued calling his name. Mike went back inside and locked the door, telling himself it was probably just exhaustion playing tricks on him after a long day. But the voice did not stop. It continued throughout the entire night, sometimes whispering, sometimes speaking at normal volume, always calling his name. The voice seemed to come from different directions, sometimes from the woods behind the cabin, sometimes from the side, occasionally from directly in front of the door. Mike did not sleep at all that night. He sat in his living room with all the lights on, his service weapon on the table in front of him, listening to the voice call to him until the sun finally rose and it stopped. By morning, Mike was exhausted and deeply unnerved. He reported the incident to the park superintendent, who suggested that it might have been other rangers playing a prank, though Mike was certain it was not. The voice had sounded wrong somehow, not quite natural, with an odd resonance that made it difficult to pinpoint the exact location it was coming from. The superintendent also suggested that the terrain might be creating unusual echo effects, distorting sounds from far away and making them seem closer. Mike did not argue, but he knew what he had heard was not an echo. Over the next week, the voice became a constant presence in Mike's life. It followed him on patrols, calling to him from the forest. It whispered outside his cabin every night, making sleep nearly impossible. Mike began experiencing other disturbing phenomena as well. Equipment would go missing from his cabin and then reappear hours later in places Mike had already searched multiple times. His GPS unit would malfunction in areas where he had never had signal problems before. Most disturbing of all, he began finding footprints in the soft earth around his cabin. The prints matched his own boots exactly, down to the specific wear patterns and distinctive tread markings. But Mike knew he had not made those tracks. Mike started documenting everything. He took photographs of the footprints, kept detailed logs of when the voice occurred and what it said, recorded the times when his equipment malfunctioned. He was trying to prove to himself that he was not losing his mind, that these things were really happening. But the more he documented, the more disturbed he became. The footprints appeared in impossible places, on surfaces where prints should not be able to form. The voice sometimes called to him using phrases that Mike had only thought, never spoken aloud. The breaking point came during a patrol 8 days after he had first heard the voice. Mike was walking along a familiar trail, alert and tense, when he heard the voice calling from directly behind him. He spun around immediately, his hand going to his weapon, and saw himself standing there. About 30 feet back on the trail, staring directly at him, was what appeared to be Mike's identical twin. Same height, same build, wearing the exact same ranger uniform, even the same equipment belt. But the expression on the doppelganger's face was completely blank, emotionless, like a mannequin that had been made to look human, but had never actually been alive. Mike drew his weapon and shouted at the figure to identify itself, his voice shaking despite his efforts to sound authoritative. The doppelganger did not respond. It did not move, did not blink, just stood there staring with those empty eyes. Mike repeated his command, louder this time, taking a step backward. The doppelganger smiled. It was a slow, deliberate smile that spread across its face, like something that had learned the expression by watching but did not understand what it meant. Then it turned and walked off the trail into the forest, moving with a strange, jerky gait that did not look quite natural. Mike did not follow it. Every instinct he had was screaming at him to run, to get away from this place as quickly as possible. He turned and ran back toward his cabin, not caring about protocol or procedure, focused only on getting somewhere he felt safe. When he reached the cabin, he immediately began packing. He threw clothes and essential belongings into a duffel bag, grabbed his personal documents, and loaded everything into his truck. He did not file a report, did not inform the superintendent he was leaving, did not follow any of the proper channels. He just drove straight out of the park without stopping. Mike resigned from the Park Service via email 2 days later, sending a brief message stating that he was leaving for personal reasons and would not be returning. His supervisor tried repeatedly to contact him, asking for a proper explanation and requesting that he at least come back to complete an exit interview. Mike ignored all the requests. He refused to discuss what had happened, refused to return to the park even to collect belongings he had left behind. Eventually, the Park Service stopped trying to contact him, and Mike's sudden departure was officially attributed to a family emergency. Mike moved across the country to a city on the opposite coast, as far from that wilderness preserve as he could get without leaving the country entirely. He took a job in an office, something completely unrelated to wilderness work or outdoor recreation. He avoided forests, avoided hiking, avoided anything that reminded him of his time as a ranger. People who knew him before the incident said he had changed fundamentally, become quieter and more withdrawn, more anxious and hypervigilant. Because Mike still hears the voice, not every night, but often enough that he can never fully relax. Late at night, when the city is as quiet as it ever gets, he hears his name being called. It is fainter now, more distant than it was at the park, but it is definitely the same voice. Mike has tried therapy, tried medication for anxiety and sleep disorders, even tried consulting with people who deal in spiritual or paranormal matters. Nothing has helped. He is convinced that whatever was in that forest followed him when he left, that it latched onto him somehow and will never let go. Mike sleeps with lights on now and keeps background noise running constantly, television or music or anything to fill the silence. Because in silence, the voice is louder. In silence, he can sometimes hear footsteps outside his apartment that sound exactly like his own. The forest that he once loved has become the source of his deepest fear. He knows he will never feel truly at peace again, will never feel safe in darkness or silence. Whatever called to him from that circular clearing in the woods is still calling, and Mike does not know if it will ever stop. Ellen had worked as a park ranger for 7 years, specializing in cultural preservation and education programs that connected visitors with the historical and spiritual significance of the land. Part of her job involved protecting sites of historical importance within the park boundaries, including several areas that were considered sacred by indigenous communities who had inhabited the region for thousands of years before it became a protected wilderness area. Ellen had always approached this work with genuine respect and care, understanding that these places held deep meaning that extended far beyond what she could fully comprehend as an outsider. She worked closely with tribal representatives to ensure that sacred sites remained protected from vandalism, unauthorized access, and the general degradation that can occur when culturally significant areas are not properly monitored. One autumn evening, Ellen received a concerning report from a hiker who had been exploring near the park boundaries. The hiker claimed to have seen a group of people conducting some kind of ceremony in an area that was clearly marked as restricted and closed to all public access. The restricted area in question was a sacred site that had been officially closed for decades due to its cultural importance. Access required bypassing multiple locked gates and ignoring numerous signs that explicitly warned against trespassing. Ellen was immediately alarmed, knowing that any unauthorized activity in that area was not only illegal, but also deeply disrespectful to the indigenous communities who still considered the site sacred. Ellen decided to investigate immediately rather than waiting until morning. She gathered her equipment, including a radio, camera to document any trespassing, and her official ranger identification. She informed the park superintendent of her plans and estimated she would be back within 2 hours. The drive to the restricted area took nearly 40 minutes along poorly maintained access roads. By the time Ellen arrived at the locked gate that marked the boundary, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows through the dense forest. She parked her vehicle, unlocked the gate using her ranger keys, and proceeded on foot along the narrow trail that led to the sacred site. The forest was unusually quiet. Ellen noticed immediately that she could not hear any birds, no insects, none of the normal ambient sounds that typically filled wilderness areas during evening hours. The silence felt oppressive and wrong, making every footstep she took seem unnaturally loud. As she approached the sacred site, she began to smell something burning. It was not ordinary wood smoke, but something else entirely. Something organic and unpleasant that made her stomach turn. Ellen proceeded cautiously, one hand on her radio, ready to call for backup if the situation warranted it. When she reached the clearing where the sacred site was located, Ellen stopped and stared, in complete disbelief at what was before her. In the center of the clearing was a large circle constructed from stones, each roughly the size of a human head, arranged with obvious precision. Inside the stone circle were symbols painted on the ground in what appeared to be blood, though Ellen desperately hoped it was just red paint. Surrounding the circle were dozens of small animal skulls, arranged in intricate geometric patterns that suggested deliberate planning and design. In the very center of it all stood a tall wooden pole, easily 8 feet high, with something tied to the top. Ellen squinted, trying to see what it was in the fading light. The shape was disturbingly humanoid, though she could not determine if it was a mannequin, a doll, or something else. Ellen raised her radio to call for backup, knowing that this situation was far beyond what she should handle alone. But before she could press the transmit button, she heard movement behind her. She spun around and saw figures emerging from the tree line in multiple directions. There were 6 of them, all wearing long dark robes and masks constructed from animal skulls. Deer skulls, bear skulls, smaller animals she could not immediately identify. They moved silently, their robes making no sound despite moving through underbrush and fallen leaves. Within seconds, they had encircled Ellen, cutting off any route of escape back to the trail. One figure stepped forward from the circle. This one was taller than the others, wearing a robe that appeared to be made from darker material and a mask fashioned from what looked like a wolf's skull. The figure raised one hand and spoke in a language Ellen did not recognize. It was not any indigenous language she had heard during her cultural training, not Spanish, not any European language she was familiar with. The words were harsh and guttural, with sounds that seemed difficult for human vocal cords to produce. The figure spoke with unmistakable authority, and the tone was clearly a command or warning. Ellen found her voice, though it shook as she spoke. She identified herself as a park ranger and stated that they were in a restricted area and needed to leave immediately. She explained that the site was protected by law and that they were committing multiple violations by being there. The tall figure did not respond to her words. Instead, it gestured toward the stone circle and spoke again in that unknown language. The other figures began to chant in response, a low rhythmic sound that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. Ellen could feel it in her chest, in her bones, a frequency that felt wrong on some fundamental level. Ellen tried to use her radio again, pressing the transmit button and speaking urgently into it, requesting immediate backup and providing her location. But the radio emitted only static, no matter which channel she tried or how she adjusted it. The tall figure stepped closer to Ellen, close enough that she could smell the musty odor of the robe and see details of the wolf skull mask. The figure reached up slowly and removed the mask, revealing the face of an elderly man beneath. His skin was deeply weathered and lined with age, his hair completely white, his eyes cold and calculating as they studied her. The man spoke to Ellen in English this time, his voice quiet but carrying clearly despite the chanting that continued around them. He told her that she had no understanding of what she had stumbled upon, that some places were not meant for outsiders regardless of their official authority or good intentions. He explained that the land remembered things that predated her culture's claim to it, that there were obligations older than the government that employed her. He said that if Ellen reported what she had seen, there would be consequences. Not threats against her personally, he clarified, but consequences for the balance that they were working to maintain. Then, as suddenly as they had appeared, the figures dispersed back into the forest in different directions, vanishing into the darkness between the trees. Ellen was left alone in the clearing, her heart pounding, her hands shaking as she tried once again to use her radio. This time it worked, connecting her immediately to dispatch. She requested backup urgently, reporting unauthorized activity at the sacred site. Within 10 minutes, she heard vehicles approaching along the access road. Rangers and law enforcement officers arrived with lights and emergency equipment, prepared for a confrontation with trespassers. But when they entered the clearing with Ellen, it was completely empty. The stone circle was gone. The symbols, the skulls, the wooden pole, all of it had vanished. The ground showed no evidence that anything had been there at all. No disturbed earth where stones had been placed. No residue from the blood or paint used for the symbols. No impressions where the skulls had rested. The clearing looked exactly as it should have looked, undisturbed and protected. Ellen was questioned extensively. Her colleagues believed that she had seen something. Her distress and fear were genuine. But the complete absence of physical evidence made it impossible to pursue an investigation. Inquiries with local indigenous leaders turned up nothing useful. The tribal representatives Ellen had worked with for years expressed concern about the incident, but said they had no knowledge of any groups conducting unauthorized ceremonies at the site. They suggested that there were always people who misappropriated indigenous spirituality for their own purposes, mixing genuine traditions with invented rituals in ways that were disrespectful to actual cultural practices. Ellen continued working as a ranger, but she never returned to that section of the park. She requested that her duties be reassigned to areas that did not include monitoring the restricted sacred sites. She began researching historical records and folklore, discovering numerous references to secretive groups that allegedly practiced ancient rituals in remote wilderness areas. Most academics dismissed these references as legend or sensationalized accounts. But Ellen was no longer certain. She knows what she saw. She knows the warning she received was genuine. To this day, Ellen avoids working alone in remote areas of the park. And she has come to understand that there are forces in the wilderness that exist beyond official recognition, operating according to rules that predate modern law and authority. Kay had been a park ranger for 3 years, working primarily in search and rescue operations during the busy summer season when the park saw tens of thousands of visitors. She was known among her colleagues for remaining calm under pressure and her ability to handle difficult medical emergencies in remote locations where professional medical help could be hours away. During her time as a ranger, Kay had dealt with everything from heat exhaustion and dehydration to broken bones, heart attacks, and severe allergic reactions. She had seen people in extreme distress, witnessed traumatic injuries, and handled situations that would have overwhelmed someone without her training and temperament. But nothing in her experience had prepared her for what happened one afternoon in late July. Kay received an emergency call on her radio from hikers on one of the park's most popular trails. A man had been found wandering near the trail in obvious medical distress. He was severely injured, incoherent, and needed immediate assistance. Kay grabbed her medical kit and emergency supplies, radioed her location and destination to dispatch, and drove as quickly as she could along the access road that led to the trailhead. When she arrived approximately 15 minutes later, she found two hikers standing over a man who was lying on the ground in the shade of a large pine tree. The man was convulsing, his body jerking violently, foam visible at the corners of his mouth. Kay's training took over immediately. She assessed the scene quickly, checking for immediate dangers, then moved to the patient to begin evaluation and treatment. But as soon as she got a clear look at the man's injuries, she realized this was far worse than anything she had encountered before. The man's body was covered in severe burns, third-degree burns across his arms, chest, neck, and face. His clothing was mostly burned away, hanging in charred tatters from his body. The smell of burned flesh was overwhelming, making Kay's eyes water and her stomach turn. She forced herself to focus, to push past the visceral horror and do her job. But what disturbed Kay most was that there was no fire anywhere in the area. No smoke, no burn marks on the surrounding vegetation, no scorched earth. Nothing to explain how this man had sustained such catastrophic burn injuries. The hikers who had found him said he had simply stumbled out of the forest already in this condition, that they had not seen or smelled any fire. Kay immediately radioed for an air ambulance, knowing that the man needed to reach a hospital as quickly as possible if he had any chance of survival. She also called for additional rangers to assist and to begin an investigation of the surrounding area to determine what had happened. While Kay worked to stabilize the patient, cleaning and covering the burns as best she could with the supplies in her medical kit, the man briefly regained consciousness. His eyes opened, unfocused and filled with pain, and he seemed to recognize that someone was helping him. He reached out with a burned hand and grabbed Kay's wrist with surprising strength for someone in his condition. He pulled her closer and whispered something in a hoarse, damaged voice. Kay had to lean in to hear him over the sound of his labored breathing. "They took me," he whispered. "They burned me. Not the only one." His eyes were desperate, pleading, as if he was trying to convey something vitally important. Kay asked who had taken him, where this had happened. But before he could answer, his eyes rolled back and he lost consciousness again. His grip on her wrist loosened and his arm fell back to the ground. Kay continued working, monitoring his vital signs, doing everything she could to keep him stable until the air ambulance arrived. 2 other rangers arrived within 20 minutes, including Tom and Ellen, both experienced search and rescue personnel. They helped Kay continue treatment while also beginning to search the immediate area for any clues about what had happened. The air ambulance arrived 30 minutes after Kay's initial call, landing in a nearby meadow. The flight paramedics took over the patient's care, moving him quickly onto a stretcher and into the helicopter. Kay provided them with a rapid briefing on his condition and what little information she had been able to gather. The helicopter lifted off, rushing the burned man toward the nearest trauma center over an hour away by ground. The man died 4 hours after arriving at the hospital. Despite the best efforts of the burn unit staff, his injuries were too severe and his body went into shock and organ failure. The official cause of death was listed as massive trauma from burns covering over 60% of his body surface area. But the medical examiners who performed the autopsy were baffled by the nature of the injuries. The burns were consistent with exposure to extreme heat, but the pattern did not match any known source. They were not consistent with fire, not with chemical burns, not with electrical burns, not with any standard burn mechanism the doctors had encountered in their careers. It was as though the man had been subjected to intense, directed heat that left no residue, no trace, no evidence of what had caused it. Kay could not let the incident go. She began investigating on her own time, looking through recent missing person reports for the region, trying to find any pattern or connection. She discovered that over the previous 6 months, 3 people had been reported missing while hiking in the park. All 3 were solo hikers who had ventured into remote backcountry areas. None of them had been found, despite search efforts. Kay brought her findings to the park superintendent and requested authorization for a focused search operation in the area where the burned man had been found. The superintendent agreed, and a team of 8 rangers was assembled for a 2-day search operation. They combed through dense forest and difficult terrain, following drainage patterns and checking areas where someone might establish a hidden camp. On the 2nd day of searching, they made a discovery that confirmed Kay's worst fears. Hidden in a ravine about 3 miles from where the burned man had been found was evidence of a campsite. It was well concealed, located in a natural depression that was invisible from above and difficult to access without knowing exactly where to look. The camp showed signs of recent activity. There were multiple fire pits, though none showed evidence of the extreme heat that would have been necessary to cause the burned man's injuries. There were supplies, tarps, rope, and disturbing implements that suggested someone had been living there for an extended period. Most horrifying were the restraints. Ropes tied to trees in configurations that were clearly designed to hold a person immobile, and in shallow graves nearby, partially concealed with branches and leaves, they found human remains. Law enforcement was called immediately, and the area was secured as a crime scene. Forensic teams spent days processing the site, documenting everything, collecting evidence. Analysis confirmed that the remains belonged to 2 of the 3 missing hikers. The victims had been held captive, subjected to prolonged torture, and eventually killed. The 3rd missing hiker was never found, and investigators feared that person's remains might be located elsewhere or that the victim might have been the burned man himself. Though identification was difficult, given the extent of his injuries. Despite intensive investigation by multiple law enforcement agencies, including the FBI, the perpetrator or perpetrators were never identified. The evidence suggested a transient individual or possibly a small group had been using the remote wilderness as a base for their crimes, taking advantage of the vast area and limited ranger patrols to operate undetected. Increased patrols and surveillance were implemented throughout the park, but no arrests were ever made. The case remains open, though investigators acknowledge that whoever was responsible has likely either left the area or ceased their activities. Kay left the Park Service 3 months after the investigation concluded. She could not continue working in a place where such horror had occurred. The image of the burned man, his desperate whisper, the knowledge that he had suffered unimaginable pain before dying, all of it haunted her constantly. She moved to an urban area and took an administrative job that had nothing to do with wilderness work or emergency response. She still has nightmares about that day. Dreams where she finds more victims in that ravine, people she could not save. People who suffered alone in the wilderness while she was patrolling trails just miles away. Kay knows now that there are monsters in the world who hide in beautiful places. The wilderness that she had loved, that she had dedicated herself to protecting, had become a hunting ground for predators who understood that isolation provides opportunity for evil. She will never look at remote forests the same way again. Will never feel that sense of peace and safety she once associated with wild places. Some trails lead to darkness that cannot be escaped, and some encounters leave scars that never truly heal.